These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. This ruined house in Baku, Azerbaijan shows the remains of a home hit by the Akalkalaki earthquake during a crowded wedding in the year 1900. The lone man standing in the rubble is the groom, the only person from the celebration who survived. Women stand in the doorways of a red light district in Calcutta, India, in the year 1964, watching the street like a stage. At their feet lies a covered form on the pavement, turning an ordinary night scene into a quiet mystery. Children play under a wall chewed by gunfire in Madrid, Spain, in the year 1936, the first year of the Spanish Civil War. The city had already become a live training ground where German and Italian planes tested bombing attacks that previewed the next World War. Exhausted civilians sit in the mud near Dong Hoi, Vietnam, on 6 June 1965, just after leaving underground shelters where they hid through 2 days of bombing and fierce fighting. KGB officers haul a captured agent toward a waiting car on a forest road near Moscow in the year 1985. The takedown ended a long surveillance operation in the fading days of the Cold War. Boys from a German party youth group strain on a hose during a public fire drill in the year 1933, their small bodies hidden under helmets and gas masks. Early in the new regime, drills like this doubled as theater, training children for real war while entertaining the crowd. Adolf Hitler inspects a teenage fighter in Berlin in early 1945, touching the boy's face while awarding last-minute medals. By this point, the leadership was so desperate it sent schoolboys to the front lines to defend the collapsing capital. Students take notes at their desks in a shattered classroom in Angola in the year 1997. The wall ripped open so wide, the lesson is visible from the street. For these children, school meant learning under hanging rebar and broken concrete, while a long civil conflict still smoldered outside. This 1940 identity card belongs to Annie Horowitz, a French Jewish girl born in Strasbourg and living in Bordeaux. Within a few years, she was deported to the Auschwitz camp and never returned, leaving this paper as one of the last traces of her life. Newly freed prisoners at Bergen-Belsen in April 1945 surround a former camp helper who once enforced the guards' orders. In the chaos after liberation, many such helpers suddenly faced the anger of those they had controlled. Adolf Hitler leans in close to a grieving widow at a funeral, his hand on her arm as the crowd looks on. Scenes like this were carefully staged to show him as a caring leader while his regime tightened its grip on Europe. In July 1865, the people convicted of plotting against President Abraham Lincoln stand on a scaffold in Washington, their heads hooded, while onlookers crowd close under umbrellas. Minutes after this photograph, the trapdoors fell, and Mary Surratt became the first woman ever executed by the United States government. The scorched Apollo 1 command module sits in a hangar after a cabin fire during a ground test at Cape Canaveral on January 27, 1967. The accident took the lives of astronauts Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, and forced NASA to redesign the spacecraft before going to the moon. Young girls in flower crowns perform the party salute at a celebration in Germany in the 1930s, staged to show the so-called ideal generation. Behind scenes like this stood the Lebensborn program, which helped bring about around 20,000 specially selected children in just 12 years. These color photos may show Alcatraz escapees John and Clarence Anglin living quietly in Brazil in 1975, years after officials declared they drowned in the bay. For more than a decade, their mother received anonymous Mother's Day flowers, and 2 unusually tall women at her 1973 funeral were rumored to be the brothers in disguise. An ocean of mourners fills the streets around Tehran in 1989 for the funeral of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, with more than 10 million people in attendance. The crowd stretched for about 20 miles in the summer heat, where the pressure of bodies caused at least 10 deaths. A towering wall of dust rolls over a South Dakota town in 1934, one of the black blizzards of the Dust Bowl years. At their peak, these storms stripped away millions of tons of topsoil and drove thousands of farm families off the Great Plains. Sharpshooter Annie Oakley lines up a stunt shot, aiming to knock an apple from the top of her dog's head without a scratch. Her arena acts in the early 1900s turned daring tricks like this into one of the most famous live shows in the world. A decorated German World War II veteran crouches beside a boy from a party youth group, showing him how to aim a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. The rows of stripes on his sleeve each mark a tank he had already knocked out. A German Luftwaffe bomber crew stands heavily bandaged after crashing near Leningrad in the year 1941. On the Eastern Front, few airmen survived being brought down over enemy lines, making this bruised group part of a very small club. American soldiers kneel around a badly wounded captive near a canal in Vietnam in 1968, one of them tipping a canteen to the man's lips. He had survived 3 days in the jungle with a cooking pot strapped over a deep belly wound. British troops drag a suspected fighter from a line of men with raised hands during street searches in Aden in 1965. The 4-year uprising in this port city left around 100 British soldiers and up to 400 local fighters dead, with many more wounded or jailed before Britain pulled out. A French military policeman in Algeria in 1956 sweeps a metal detector over townspeople before they can pass, searching for hidden weapons under robes and baskets. The Algerian War of Independence turned daily life into a maze of checkpoints and patrols. Aboriginal men stand barefoot in irons outside a stone lockup in Australia in the year 1889, wearing only simple loincloths for an official photo. A truck and a car cling to a narrow strip of pavement as floodwater roars over a road in Tennessee during the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1927. No clear report was ever filed on the drivers or passengers, leaving this scene frozen as an unsolved question in disaster history. Men in northern China pose in 1900 with giant hunting guns so big they are almost small cannons. A single blast from these oversized weapons could drop an entire flock of birds at once, which is why such guns were later banned. A sea of people fills the square in Lawrenceville, Georgia, on May 8, 1908, all straining to see Henry Campbell in his dark suit standing on the platform at the center. Spectacles like this public hanging drew thousands and were soon pushed behind prison walls as attitudes toward punishment began to change. Bob Melvin sits in the doorway of his trailer in Fargo, North Dakota in 1976, his face reshaped by a rare medical condition. On the carnival circuit, he was advertised as the man with two faces, drawing crowds whose tickets quietly paid for his everyday life. Harry Houdini hangs upside down above the glass tank for his new Chinese water torture cell escape in the year 1910. Locked by the ankles and lowered headfirst into water, he turned this stunt into one of the most talked about illusions on Earth. Rows of giant steel boilers stand ready at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast around 1910, each one taller than a man and studded with thousands of rivets. Together, 29 boilers like these burned hundreds of tons of coal a day to drive Titanic's engines and power her electric lights and elevators. Chunks of ice and floating timber turned the Moscow River into a wide moving wreck during the Great Flood of 1927. Workers pole their way across the waterlogged city while the Cathedral of Christ the Savior watches from the higher bank. Shattered streetcars sit in sticky wreckage after a giant molasses tank burst in Boston in 1919, sending 2.3 million gallons of syrup racing through the North End at about 35 miles per hour. The wave took 21 lives, hurt more than 150 people. A London police officer directs traffic in a full gas mask during a civil defense drill on 28 September 1938, as Europe holds its breath over the Munich crisis. The sign on his chest asking, "Have you got yours?" was meant to push every passerby to carry a mask in case the next siren was real. Irma Gressa, a young SS camp guard, is photographed in 1945, soon after Allied forces captured her. Within months, she would face a public trial for war crimes at Bergen-Belsen and be executed at just 22 years old. 74-year-old Dr. Klaus Karl Schilling stands on the gallows at Landsberg, Germany, on 28 May 1946 as U.S. military guards ready the rope. He had been sentenced to death for malaria experiments on about 1,200 Dachau prisoners, many of whom never came back. In 1978, a smiling local businessman, later convicted of a series of serious crimes, shakes hands with the U.S. First Lady during a photo line. The security pin on his lapel, which meant he had been cleared by the Secret Service, became a major embarrassment once his double life was exposed. James Earl Ray, the man held responsible for the death of Martin Luther King Jr., is led in handcuffs through London in 1968, wearing a protective vest. He had been caught after fleeing to the United Kingdom on a false passport. Soviet soldiers cover the captured Reichstag in Berlin with chalk and charcoal in May 1945, scrawling their names, hometowns, and Hitler kaputt across the battered columns. Decades later, restorers even preserved some of this graffiti inside the rebuilt Parliament building. A Jewish family walks through Berlin in 1941, each forced to wear a yellow star on their chest so everyone could see who they were. By then, the Nuremberg laws had stripped such families of citizenship and rights, turning a simple walk down the street into an act done under watching eyes. A long exposure from a Royal Air Force bomber over Brest, France, on January 31, 1941, turns exploding anti-aircraft shells into a glowing web of lines beneath the plane. Each streak marks a shot aimed at that single aircraft, and the crew had to hold course through it to drop their bombs. In 1939, a young boy takes part in the Clark doll test, asked to choose between a dark-skinned doll and a light-skinned doll. The results showed many children favored the light doll, evidence that later helped the U.S. Supreme Court strike down segregated schools in Brown v. Board of Education. John Dillinger lounges handcuffed to a deputy during a court hearing in Crown Point, Indiana, in early 1934, while the whole room stares at the most famous bank robber in America. Just weeks later, he would stroll out of this very jail using a fake wooden gun, rob a few more banks. In Vienna in 1938, Jewish residents are forced to scrub the pavement while uniformed men and townspeople watch and even smile. Public scenes of humiliation like this followed the annexation of Austria and foreshadowed the mass deportations of Jews to camps across Europe. Members of a masked nativist order pose in white and dark robes at a night rally in Northern California in 1918. Women from its sister group stand in the front ranks, showing how the movement drew in whole families, not just men. European officers in the Belgian Congo around 1900 drill with a mounted machine gun on a riverboat, while local paddlers sit behind them. Tiny craft plus heavy weapon turned even a narrow river into a moving outpost of empire. Danish resistance fighters hold 2 German soldiers at gunpoint in a Copenhagen street in 1945, using a doorway as an improvised prison. Moments like this showed how quickly power flipped as underground groups stepped into the open to help free their towns. Women sit in a dim back room of a Naples red light house in 1945, watched by their manager as they wait for the next knock at the door. In the shattered port city, visiting American soldiers became their main clients and an unofficial second currency. A woman in the Belgian Congo poses in 1935 to show elaborate scarification across her back, including ancient good luck symbols on each shoulder. In many Central African communities, these raised designs were a form of beauty and identity, cut into the skin in youth and carried proudly for life. A nighttime inferno lights up central Bangkok in 1990 after a liquid gas tanker crashed off a highway exit and burst into flame. The fire raged for almost a full day, destroying 38 buildings and costing 90 lives, with more than 120 people hurt. A French patient in 1890 wears an iron frame to hold his broken jaw in place, an early form of reconstructive treatment. Before modern plates and screws, surgeons used external cages like this for weeks while the bones slowly knit back together. A masked doctor in China listens to a patient's lungs during a deadly epidemic around the year 1900. His hood, gown, and layered cloth masks were early attempts at protective gear long before modern biohazard suits. An artist in 1918 carefully paints lifelike face masks for soldiers who suffered severe facial injuries in the First World War. These thin metal prostheses let men who had lost their features step back into public life with a new, carefully crafted face. Villagers in Russia crowd a field around 1900 for a massive bare-knuckle contest, fighting in teams in the old wall-against-wall style. These holiday battles were treated almost like a sport, drawing whole towns to watch until police or priests had to step in. Peasants in the Russian countryside pose with a captured German spy who tried to slip through their village disguised as a woman in 1914. In the background, soldiers line up, ready to take this strange prize of the first war year into official custody. Soviet officials in 1921 sort and weigh confiscated Orthodox bishop crowns, their jewels piled like treasure on a work table. After the revolution, church gold like this was seized across Russia to feed the new state and help pay for famine relief. An early motor scooter from 1919 carries an older gentleman along, powered by a tiny four-cylinder engine mounted over the rear wheel. Machines like this were awkward, but showed how people already dreamed of city travel on small personal scooters a century ago. Serbia's first armed airplane, a French-built Blériot Anbins II, stands ready in 1915 with pilot Tomic at the controls and observer Mihailovic behind a newly mounted machine gun. This fragile wooden monoplane was one of the earliest attempts to turn a scouting aircraft into a flying weapon. A World War I veteran in 1920 uses a custom metal arm that holds a welding torch, turning his amputation into a working tool. Early prosthetics like this helped wounded soldiers learn new trades and quietly pushed the idea of bionic work gear decades before robots. Men carry huge mock crowns through a British street in the early 1920s, watched by amused onlookers. Later tales said they were factory workers doing a walk of shame for wrong crown sizes for King George V. A 19th century surgical team poses with saws and clamps around a man laid out on a wooden crate, likely moments before a leg operation. Stark photos like this, later recycled with joke captions, show how rough and bare medical practice could be before modern anesthesia. The Diamond T Doodlebug was a futuristic Texaco tanker from 1935 with a low teardrop body and the driver sitting almost over the front axle. It used a diesel-electric drive like a train locomotive, making this gas truck one of the strangest and most advanced road machines of its time. Shoppers crowd a nearly empty grocery store in Vilnius in 1990, queuing for whatever basic goods arrive during the final years of the Soviet shortage crisis. By this time, people often spent hours in lines for sugar, soap, or meat, sometimes registering in special queue books just to keep their place. Bruce Lee briefly tangles with a then-unknown stuntman named Jackie Chan in a quick fight scene from Enter the Dragon in 1973. Years later, Chan loved to tell how Lee accidentally hit him for real, then apologized so kindly that Chan pretended to be hurt longer just to keep his attention. British troops put up this stark sign at the gates of liberated Bergen-Belsen in May 1945, spelling out what they had found inside. It turned the former camp entrance into a permanent warning to visitors about the human cost of the Nazi regime. Ronald Reagan walks among China's terracotta warriors during his 1984 state visit, pausing beside a headless clay soldier in Xi'an. The vast underground force of over 8,000 life-size figures had been discovered only a decade earlier by local farmers digging a well. A British soldier on patrol during the Northern Ireland conflict crouches with his rifle while local children crowd around him, turning a tense street corner into a playground. For many Belfast kids in 1981, soldiers, armored vehicles, and checkpoints were just part of their everyday backdrop. Disney animators study the movement of bubbles in a glass bottle while planning a scene for Pinocchio in the late 1930s. To get the water just right, they filmed real liquid in glass containers and traced it frame by frame, helping pioneer realistic effects animation. Workers assemble the Statue of Liberty's body and torch in a Paris courtyard before it was shipped to New York Harbor, 1878. France built and paid for the statue itself, while the United States funded the pedestal, and later Gustave Eiffel designed its iron skeleton. Japanese soldiers toss rifle ammunition overboard as part of Allied disarmament operations off Japan, 21 September 1945. Under U.S. occupation, vast stockpiles of munitions and much of Japan's wartime industry were systematically dismantled and destroyed. Albert Einstein lectures at Carnegie Tech in 1934, the chalkboard filled with the derivation that leads to his world-changing formula. This is the only known photograph capturing Einstein and the equation in the same frame. An American soldier wanders through the shattered monument to the Battle of the Nations in Leipzig, Germany, April 1945. This massive 1813 memorial became one of the city's last Nazi strongholds, its SS garrison forced to surrender after pounding U.S. artillery fire. Robert Wadlow, at 20 years old and already 8 ft-11 and 2.72 meters tall, towers over his father in this 1938 photograph. The Alton Giant remains the tallest person in recorded medical history. Fire crews battle a raging oil well blowout on Signal Hill, California, during the height of the Southern California oil boom in 1931. The inferno burned thousands of barrels of crude and lit the sky over Los Angeles like a second sunrise. During World War II, British intelligence housed captured German officers in a comfortable, secretly bugged mansion, such as Trent Park. Hidden microphones recorded their relaxed conversations and revealed troop movements, new weapons, and other secrets for Allied planners. Workers rebuild Broadway's cable car tracks amid traffic and trolley cars in New York City, 1891. The project modernized one of Manhattan's busiest streets, laying the groundwork for the city's future transit system. Weapons seized from John Dillinger's gang on display at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., mid-1930s. Among them is a rare modified .38 Super Pistol with a Thompson foregrip that fired in full auto like a compact machine gun. Nikola Tesla examines his experimental induction motors in his New York laboratory, 1898. These AC motors became the backbone of modern power grids, turning rotating magnetic fields into the work that runs factories, cities, and homes today. Miss World contestants sit on an airplane wing in 1953 while their legs reflect in the polished metal above a crowd of grinning ground crew. The mirrored view makes the women look like they're hanging upside down over the runway. A promotional model poses as Miss Magic Marker 1954, showing off the company's new felt-tip pen with MM drawn on her chest. Early post-war marketing often used beauty contests and pin-up-style ads to make office supplies feel modern and glamorous. A Soviet combat medic bandages a wounded comrade among the ruins during street fighting in the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942. While small groups held shattered buildings room by room, Soviet forces encircled about 250,000 Axis troops in the city, and only around 5,000 of those taken prisoner ever returned home. This rare photo shows children sharing a single bowl of food outside a wooden house in Moscow in the early 1900s. It was captured by photographer Maxim P. Dmitriev, who quietly recorded how hard everyday life was for Russian peasants long before television or social media existed. In December 1889, this bold holiday ad from Aloes in St. Louis offered magic lanterns, early image projectors, as the must-have gift for children. Solid gold spectacles for $5 and photographic cameras promised that science and entertainment could fit neatly under a Victorian Christmas tree. This photo shows a wartime room in occupied Belgium used by German forces, later found with rough coffins and unusual standing equipment. After liberation, it was photographed as evidence of how prisoners were handled here during the Second World War. Families pack a narrow alley in the Whitechapel slums of London in 1888. Living door to door with almost no space or privacy. That same year, these streets were gripped by fear during the Jack the Ripper case, a series of unsolved night attacks on local women. Prisoners in striped uniforms marked with triangles stand in line at a German camp, where men jailed under paragraph 175 were held for same-sex relations. Even after liberation in 1945, many stayed behind bars under this law. Young U.S. Marines, still covered in oil and dust, drink hot coffee after a hard World War II battle in the 1940s. For many, this quick pause in a crowded mess room was the only quiet moment between hours of combat at sea or on Pacific Islands. In 1953, young lawyer Nelson Mandela trains in rooftop boxing rounds with pro fighter Jerry Malloy above downtown Johannesburg. Mandela said boxing taught him discipline and calm under pressure, skills he later carried into his leadership of South Africa. An iron worker stands in a Stalingrad foundry in 1932 during the Soviet Union's first 5-year plans to rapidly build heavy industry. These workshops produced the steel that later armed the Red Army in the Second World War, while daily life for workers stayed marked by long hours, heat, and dust. In 1942, SS leader Heinrich Himmler stands with a Ukrainian boy in occupied territory, posing for a staged photo linked to the Lebensborn program. Under this policy, thousands of children from Eastern Europe were taken from their families. Women crowd around a demonstration voting machine in New York City as an instructor shows them exactly how to cast a ballot. Many are new voters and recent immigrants, preparing to support Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Lehman with confidence on Election Day. Engineers in the United States test new stockings on a model leg in 1940, searching for a smoother fit and stronger fabric. Around this time, nylon stockings were being perfected, about to replace silk and become one of the most desired wartime fashion items. A rebel stands against a prison wall in Mexico in 1910, facing a line of government soldiers with raised rifles at the start of the Mexican Revolution. Images like this show how quickly early protests turned into open-armed repression as the old regime tried to hold power. Rows of boys in striped robes race their fingers across wooden abacuses in a Japanese classroom around 1920. Before electronic calculators, this tool trained students to do fast mental arithmetic for business and daily life. In 1929, P. Kreis lies in a glass enclosure in Poznan, Poland, under constant public watch as he attempts a world record fast. Bottles and notes line the floor around him, turning his bed into a controlled experiment in how long a person can live without food. Italian Alpine troops climb a sheer rock face in 1915, roped together with full packs and rifles during the First World War. These mountain units helped Italy open a high-altitude front against Austro-Hungary along the steep border peaks in northern Italy. This photo shows members of the Cairo Gang, a British intelligence group in Dublin that tracked Irish Republican Army activity in 1920. On 21 November that year, Michael Collins's network sent teams to their lodgings, and most of the men in this picture were shot in coordinated morning attacks. In 1918, the small Italian motor torpedo boat, Mass 15, speeds across the Adriatic with 2 torpedoes on its deck. On 10 June 1918, this 15-meter craft slipped past escorts and sank the Austro-Hungarian battleship Szent István, giving Italy a major naval success. A woman stands tied to a tree during a staged outdoor scene in the United States in 1936. Such private, playful snapshots show how people were already using personal cameras to record unusual moments long before home video existed. On an Iranian beach in 1976, women in bikinis walk past another woman wrapped in a full covering, 2 dress codes sharing the same shoreline. This scene comes from the final years before the 1979 revolution. A blindfolded girl in Mexico in 1929 raises a stick to smash a giant doll-shaped piñata hanging in a courtyard. In this tradition, the blindfold represents faith, and breaking the piñata showers sweets as a reward for courage and persistence. A wrecked Formula One car burns upside down at the 1962 Belgian Grand Prix, while the race continues at full speed on the track above. The driver survived with only minor injuries, a reminder of how few safety rules protected racers in that era. This unusual armored car, built by Spanish anarchist militias in 1938, looks more like a smooth metal whale than a normal tank. Behind its curved armor plates, volunteer fighters used it to move safely through city streets during the Spanish Civil War. In the 1930s, doctors and judges examined women's posture in perfect back contests, looking for the straightest spine and most balanced muscles. These events mixed early health screening with beauty pageant culture, long before modern fitness tests and X-ray checks. This early breathing apparatus, likely from the First World War era, used canisters and a hose to filter poisoned air before it reached the lungs. Designs like this were rushed into service after gas weapons first appeared, forcing engineers to invent practical protection in just a few years. In 1961, Cuban leader Fidel Castro hugs Yuri Gagarin, the first human to travel into space only months after his Vostok 1 flight. The meeting in Havana turned the young Soviet cosmonaut into a Cold War superstar across Latin America. A young partisan stands on the gallows in 1944 with his arms raised, moments before execution by occupying forces. Witnesses said he used his final seconds to shout a slogan promising freedom for the people, turning the scene into a lasting symbol of resistance. B-17 flying fortresses pushed through a sky filled with black bursts of German anti-aircraft fire during a raid over Merseburg in 1944. Each dark cloud marks a shell exploding at bomber height, forcing crews to hold formation while knowing a single hit could tear a plane apart. In 1945, a U.S. officer inspects 500-year-old wooden statues hidden in the basement of Nuremberg Castle, traced back to St. Mary's Cathedral in Krakow. They were among thousands of artworks removed by Nazi authorities and later recovered by Allied art rescue teams. In 1915, German soldiers near the Western Front use a working elephant to drag heavy logs that horses and trucks could not move in the mud. Many of these animals came from circuses or zoos, briefly turned into living tractors for the war effort. In 1976, Viking 1 sent back this first close photo from the surface of Mars, showing a flat plain scattered with rocks and dust. Part of the lander's footpad is visible at right, proof that a human-made machine had safely touched down on another planet. In 1956, engineers built the Vespa Tap, a military scooter fitted with a 3-inch recoilless rifle for airborne troops. The lightweight Bazooka Vespa was designed to be dropped by parachute, so 2 soldiers could quickly assemble a surprise anti-armor weapon. In 1953, Marilyn Monroe slips on long gloves with stylist Gladys Rasmussen as she prepares for the premiere of How to Marry a Millionaire. Her fitted lace gown and mirror reflection capture the studio-era ritual of turning a movie star into a red carpet image. This is the cockpit of a Boeing B-29 Superfortress, one of the most advanced bombers of World War II, with pressurized crew cabins and remote-controlled gun turrets. 2 pilots sat side by side under this wide glass canopy, managing 4 powerful engines. In January 1992, a concert ticket for $19.50 bought a lineup of Red Hot Chili Peppers with opening acts Nirvana and Pearl Jam at the Salem Armory. 3 bands that would define 90s rock shared one stage in what was then just another all-ages show. After World War II, a secret group of Jewish survivors, known as Nachum or the Avengers, tracked down former Nazi officials responsible for mass killings. Their goal was to bring these men to justice, and they even drew up plans to poison food and water supplies used by ex-SS members. In August 1963, a gang led by Bruce Reynolds stopped a Royal Mail train at Bridego Bridge and stole about £2.6 million in used banknotes. Their hidden insider, known only as the Ulsterman, was never firmly identified, and most of the money has still never been found. A banker in China secretly took money from his own workplace to buy endless lottery tickets, hoping one huge win would cover everything. Instead, he lost it all, fell about $7 million into debt, and is now serving a prison sentence for fraud. In 1915, a wrestler billed as the Masked Marvel steps into a room at Manhattan Opera House, hiding his identity under a simple black hood. He is considered the earliest known masked wrestler in the United States, starting a tradition that later shaped modern pro wrestling characters. A vast drill hall has been turned into an emergency ward during the 1918 influenza pandemic, with cots lined up in strict rows. Staff and patients wear cloth masks as cities struggle to treat thousands of cases with almost no modern medicine or intensive care. 17-year-old Jonathan Jackson leaves the Marin County Courthouse on 7 August 1970, holding a gun and forcing Judge Harold Haley and others in front of him as hostages. The escape attempt, meant to demand freedom for the Soledad brothers, including his brother George, ended in a chaotic shootout that left several people dead. Two wrestlers battle in a ring covered with hundreds of slippery smelt during the Smelt Carnival in Marinette, Wisconsin in 1939. The messy match turned a local fish run into a wild spectator sport, with the crowd cheering every fall into the squirming catch. Director James Cameron and Arnold Schwarzenegger rehearsed the arm repair scene on the low-budget set of The Terminator in 1984. Much of the cyborg damage was created with practical makeup and animatronic props rather than computer effects. Navy recovery crews circle the Mercury Atlas 8 capsule on the ship's deck in 1962, shortly after Walter Schirra's 6-orbit flight. The scorched heat shield and parachute gear show how this tiny cone carried its pilot through both space and fiery re-entry. Chinese border guards display a damaged Soviet helmet after clashes on Zhenbao Island during the Sino-Soviet border conflict in March 1969. This small frozen river island briefly became the focus of a major standoff between two nuclear-armed communist powers. Chinese troops hurl rocks from a trench after exhausting their ammunition during the Battle of Triangle Hill in late 1952. This Korean war fight over a single ridge caused thousands of casualties on both sides for only a few hundred meters of high ground. Thousands of Hitler Youth form a giant swastika pattern in Berlin's Olympic Stadium on 20 June 1938, a year before the war began. Events like this were staged to impress crowds and show how deeply the regime tried to shape children's lives through mass rallies and discipline. In 1920, a young Ho Chi Minh, then known as Nguyen Ai Quoc, stands to address the French Communist Party in Paris about colonial rule. From meetings like this, he shaped the ideas that later guided Vietnam's long fight for independence. In 1956, an Indiana school invited students to handle an unloaded rifle in class while learning basic gun safety rules. Lessons like this were common in rural America, where hunting culture and marksmanship programs were closely tied to public schools. Fay Schulman, a Jewish photographer turned partisan fighter, poses with a captured gun in the winter forest after escaping the Lenin Ghetto massacre in 1942. She risked her life to secretly photograph raids and camps, later saying her pictures proved that Jews fought back. This early 20th century exercise device spins a ring of padded rods around a baby to force kicking, supposedly to build leg muscles. It is one of many experimental child-raising gadgets abandoned once modern pediatric science and safety standards improved. French soldiers in 1917 pose with their regimental flag, shot to shreds by months of frontline fighting. The tricolor is patched, burned, and full of holes, but still carried as a symbol that the regiment itself has survived the war so far. On 22 June 1941, people in Moscow crowd around loudspeakers as they hear Molotov announce that Germany has attacked the Soviet Union at dawn, launching Operation Barbarossa. In the 4 years that follow, about one-third of Soviet men and an estimated 9 out of 10 men born in 1923 will be killed or die from war-related causes. 4 Austro-Hungarian battleships, a mix of new dreadnoughts and older pre-dreadnoughts, steam in tight formation across the Adriatic during the late years of World War I. This rare photo captures a navy that vanished only months later when the empire collapsed in 1918. Thousands of people pack Central Park on the night of July 20, 1969, watching the Apollo 11 moon landing on giant outdoor screens with searchlights cutting into the New York sky. For a few hours, the whole city paused as Neil Armstrong's first steps were broadcast live from nearly 400,000 kilometers away. In July 1987, Italian robber Valerio Vice led the Knightsbridge security deposit raid in London, emptying hundreds of safe deposit boxes in one of Britain's biggest bank heists. Days later, police traced a single fingerprint from the vault and arrested him at the wheel of his Ferrari. At dawn on June 6, 1944, heavily loaded American soldiers wade through the surf toward Omaha Beach in the first assault wave of D-Day. Many carried more than 30 kilograms of gear as they tried to cross open sand and steel obstacles under intense defensive fire to open the Western Front in Europe. An immigrant family steps off the gangway onto Ellis Island in 1904, tags on their clothes showing they have passed the first inspection. Between 1892 and 1954, more than 12 million people entered the United States through this processing center, hoping to start new lives. Enslaved workers stand with hoes and baskets on a Brazilian coffee plantation in 1885, just 3 years before slavery was finally abolished there. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to end legal slavery, and coffee profits had depended on exhausting hand labor like this. Carrie Nation, famous for storming saloons with a hatchet in the early 1900s, became a symbol of the American temperance movement. She called her raids hatchetations, smashing liquor bottles and bar fixtures while preaching that alcohol was destroying families. Egyptian workers carry the newly uncovered bust of Tutankhamun out of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, escorted by officials and guards. Taken in the early 1920s by photographer Harry Burton, the image shows how fragile royal treasures were moved by hand before being studied and displayed. Steve and Charlie Utter stand by the fresh grave of their friend Wild Bill Hickok at Deadwood's Mount Moriah Cemetery in August 1876. Hickok had been shot from behind by Jack McCall days earlier while playing cards, giving rise to the legend of the Dead Man's Hand. Most of the boys on this Indiana baseball team in 1908 spent their days working long shifts in a glass factory instead of going to school. Photos like this were used by reformers to push for child labor laws that would finally limit such work for children in the United States. Eduard Bloch, a Jewish physician in Linz, cared for Clara Hitler during her final illness in 1907 and was warmly thanked by her son, Adolf. Decades later, even as anti-Semitic laws spread across Austria, Bloch received rare personal protection and permission from Hitler's office to emigrate to the United States. In 1968, civilians in Hue pedal bicycles and sell street food among ruins left by one of the Vietnam War's fiercest urban battles, the Tet Offensive. Weeks of house-to-house fighting destroyed about half the city's buildings, yet daily markets and traffic returned almost immediately amid the shattered walls. In 1908, this boy sits on the steps of his Ohio home wearing torn clothes and shoes held together by nails. A snapshot of how deeply poverty hit many black families decades before the New Deal safety net. At that time, about 1 in 5 American children worked for wages. A Maori priest in New Zealand is ceremonially fed with a long wooden spoon in 1930, so his hands stay free and his sacred status remains respected. Traditional clothing, woven from flax and feathers, shows how daily life and spiritual customs were tightly linked in Maori villages at the time. Outside Chicago's Biograph Theater in July 1934, moviegoers crowd under the marquee of Manhattan Melodrama just after federal agents fatally shot bank robber John Dillinger on the sidewalk. A German city street lies almost empty in the late 1940s, its church tower still standing, while the surrounding buildings are shattered from wartime bombing. The tilted street lamp and piles of rubble show how everyday life had to restart among ruins before large-scale rebuilding even began. Police and curious onlookers crowd outside the Tokyo headquarters of the Communist Party of Japan as occupation authorities order it closed for 30 days in 1950. Under General Douglas MacArthur, even legal political parties could be suddenly frozen during early Cold War tension. Apache children stand in front of the wagon that is taking them to school on the Mescalero Reservation in New Mexico in the year 1904. Soon, many native children would be sent to faraway boarding schools where their hair, language, and clothes were changed to fit government ideas of proper American life. 18-year-old Ruth Oliphant is inspected by instructor civils while training to work as a car hop at a drive-in restaurant in Houston, Texas in the year 1940. The young women were taught clear speech, polite posture, and even to laugh at customers' jokes so the place would feel lively and earn more money. Two members of the Haitian police wearing sashes that read "Force à la loi," power to the law, stand with a young woman in Haiti in the year 1914. This was taken just 1 year before foreign troops arrived in 1915, which would place Haiti under outside control for nearly 2 decades. Officials carry out quick health checks on new arrivals at Ellis Island in New York Harbor in the year 1923. Anyone who failed this fast eye and scalp test could be held on the island for weeks or even sent back across the ocean. African American troops known as Buffalo Soldiers stand guard over Spanish soldiers who have laid down their arms in Cuba in the year 1898. These units fought in some of the hardest battles of the Spanish-American War while still facing strict separation in their own army. A stylish woman walks through Mexico City in the year 1950 while nearby men turn their heads and stare at her every move. This image was one of a series of photos showing how she was followed by watchful eyes on almost every street she walked. Young women trained by the French forces pose with their weapons for a staged magazine photo in French Indochina in the year 1948. Images like this were used to show that local women were joining modern security units during the rising struggle over the future of the colony. An African-American soldier from the famous Harlem Regiment stands on crutches with his mother in New York City in the year 1918 after returning from service in France during the First World War. His unit, later known by a fierce nickname, spent more days on the front line than any other American regiment. A lone firefighter stands in front of smoking ruins after the Great Earthquake in San Francisco in the year 1906. The shaking and the fires that followed ruined almost 80% of the city, turning its busy downtown into a silent shell in just a few hours. A young schoolgirl in Honolulu, Hawaii, is fitted for a small training gas mask by an officer and a nurse in the year 1942. After the Pacific War reached Hawaii, even children practiced using masks in case smoke or gas ever drifted over their classrooms. Argentinian troops sit behind barbed wire in a rough camp on the Falkland Islands after surrendering to British forces in the year 1982. The short 2-month conflict left about 225 British and 649 Argentinian service members dead, plus over 14,000 wounded or captured, before London kept control of the remote islands. Italian leader Benito Mussolini relaxes at the beach with his wife Rachele and 3 of their 5 children in the early 1940s. Away from public displays, he liked simple family trips to the sea, a sharp contrast to the severe image he kept in politics. Adolf Hitler signs an autograph for a group of uniformed boys in Germany in the 1930s. This youth group was used to shape young minds with loyal messages long before the coming war. Mexican leader Pancho Villa stands with his wife and a small group of supporters in the year 1914 during the height of the Mexican Revolution. At this time, he was powerful enough that news companies in the United States paid to film his campaigns like a real-life movie star. William Howard Taft, future President of the United States, rides a water buffalo while serving as civil governor of the Philippines in the year 1902. He was known in Manila for embracing local customs, even using these powerful animals for some of his inspection trips. Ty Cobb shakes hands with Detroit Tigers ballpark assistant Alex Rivers at Navin Field in the year 1919. Though later stories painted him as a rough figure, interviews from the time show him speaking in support of black players joining the major leagues. Emergency workers stand among wreckage outside Sydney's Hilton Hotel after a street explosion in the year 1978. The blast, aimed at a visiting Indian leader, took 3 lives and injured many more, shocking a country that had almost no history of events like this. Children glide on early roller skates near the Eiffel Tower in Paris in the year 1941. German authorities used scenes like this, filmed by their own or hired French photographers, to show a calm and cheerful city under occupation. Former Confederate veterans and their families pose with a battle flag at a reunion in Huntsville, Alabama, in the year 1928. The 2 black men on the right had also served with Southern forces, a rare and disputed story, since most black men in that army were forced into support work and were only officially allowed to be armed in the final weeks of the war. Chinese showman Zhang Shichai, billed as Chang the Giant, towers over visitors while touring the United States in 1868. Standing, said to be over 8 feet tall, he spent more than a decade traveling through Europe, America, and Australia, and may have been the tallest person ever clearly photographed. Armenian women and children stand behind barbed wire in a camp in the Ottoman Empire in the year 1915. That year, hundreds of thousands of Armenians died during forced marches and deportations, and many families like this were broken apart forever. Michigan National Guard troops marched down a damaged Detroit street in 1967 as a young boy raises his hands to show he is not a threat. That summer saw 159 urban uprisings across the United States, and the Detroit unrest became one of the most destructive, leaving 43 people dead and thousands of buildings damaged or looted. Jewish men and women pray at the Western Wall in Jerusalem in 1899, when the city was still under Ottoman rule. For centuries, different empires controlled this place, yet local Jews, Christians, and Muslims were usually allowed to worship here as long as they paid special taxes to the rulers. Women crowd into a famous Paris cabaret in 1930 that catered openly to women who loved women, a rare sight in most of the world at that time. Between the wars, Paris nightlife was known for clubs, art, and films that pushed the boundaries of romance and style far beyond what many other countries allowed. Jewish women and children from Hungary stand beside the train after arriving at Auschwitz in 1944, still holding the small bags they brought from the ghetto. After Germany occupied Hungary that year, more than 500,000 Hungarian Jews were quickly sent to this camp, and most of them would never return. An aerial view shows wrecked vehicles littering a 6-lane road in Iraq in 1991 after coalition aircraft hit a huge Iraqi column retreating from Kuwait. More than 2,000 vehicles were destroyed and several hundred people died. Belle Starr, born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848, was a well-known woman outlaw who insisted on riding side saddle like a lady while wearing 2 pistols at her waist. She built a reputation as a horse thief and frontier schemer, then died from a gunshot in 1889 under such strange conditions that her last ride is still unsolved.